Do Protestants really worship God? That's the question we're going to be answering today. Spoiler alert, we do. My name is Stephen Cram, and welcome to My Apologies. Welcome to a quick response edition of My Apologies. I'm actually not sure how quick this is going to be. It might be a long response edition, but we'll see. I'm taking a quick break from our Mere Christianity series just because I've been listening to a couple of podcasts, and recently I saw a video that posed the question, do Protestants really worship God? And I thought most of the video is on Shameless Popery's channel. I thought most of the video was really fair, but then at the end, when it came to his conclusion, he kind of jumped off the deep end, and so I wanted to talk about that. And to give it to some context, I'll go through and we'll watch an additional podcast. So we'll start with that first. Then we'll listen to what he said on his Shameless Popery channel. And then we'll look into some church history in order to kind of bring it all to a closure. And the overall subject that is causing the question of are Protestants worshiping is the Catholic view of transubstantiation. So we'll get into that as well. I know we've been going through Mere Christianity for a while. We're getting up to like episode 10 now, I think. But we're pausing on this real quick to adjust this topic, and we'll go back to the series. Don't worry. I reserve the right to pause the series in order to address little fun things that I have here. After all, the channel is called My Apologies, not C.S. Lewis's Apologies. So we'll be back to that next week, that series. But I hope you've been enjoying the C.S. Lewis content. I'd love to hear your comments on it. And if you haven't heard it yet, please go check it out. The ones that you'll see on the channel won't have videos, but still fun. So before we get started on this response, I wanted to say first off that I've been really inspired by two particular channels on YouTube. And those are Pints with Aquinas, a Catholic channel, and Truth Unites, a Protestant channel. And specifically, I love the way that they address challenging issues from their own denominational standpoint, and they give their opinion boldly and without reservation. But at the same time, they're really kind and charitable towards the other side. They each try to do what's called steel manning, which means give the best possible argument for the other side, put the other side's best foot forward, and then address that argument. They don't straw man, where they put up a poorly constructed version of the argument and attack it. They're very charitable, they're very kind, and so I'm going to aim to do the same thing in this video and all videos going forward that address issues that are kind of hot button in the Christian world like this one. What this video is not trying to address is whether or not the Catholic view of the Eucharist is correct. We're not going to really address if transubstantiation is the correct view or not. We're simply going to look at what has been said from a Catholic point of view and then offer a Protestant response. Give something for Protestants to kind of hang on to on the other side of this debate. So, starting out, we're going to listen to an episode of the Catechism in a Year podcast by Father Mike Schmitz. And this is a great podcast. I'll admit that this podcast, listening to this episode, was actually what got this whole train of thought started. And it was because I thought he presented a really clear and fair argument of what Protestants think about the subject of the Eucharist. I was amazed. And the reason why I went to listen to this episode was not because I was really trying to dig into the content. It was mostly because I was looking at the religion and spirituality section in Apple Podcasts and trying to see who is at the top of the list. And he has 2 podcasts in the top 3. And so I was like, hey, maybe he's doing something right. I should do some research. So I stumbled into this episode as I was listening to his podcast, doing some research into how, like, the technical aspects, and I thought the content was really good as well. So this episode day 189 is on the worship of the Eucharist, right? And so in this subject is something that's foreign to a lot of Protestants, but he explains kind of the doctrinal reason why Catholics would worship the Eucharist. And about halfway through, he tells a story about his interaction with some Protestants he had. And so I want to go ahead and play that for us, and then we'll engage with that on the other side.
So this is truly God. And therefore, there is worship of the Eucharist. We bow down before the Eucharist. And this is remarkable. It's so remarkable that a couple of years ago, we put on some camps in our diocese. And so a lot of times you don't have like a Catholic campground or Catholic facility. We just use other people's facilities. And there is a denomination that allows, graciously lets us, for a fee, lets us have a camp. That's incredible. And at one point, the director of the camp said, hey, Father, I got to talk to you about this because some of our board of directors, they have a problem with Catholics being here. And I'm like, okay, well, tell me more. And he said, well, some of them are saying that they're asking the question, do we really want to have at our camp, on our facility, this kind of idolatry? Like, what? Say more. Those Catholics, they believe that bread and wine actually is God. They worship, they bow down as if that bread and wine really is God. And we won't want that idolatry to happen in our camp and on our grounds, right? In our facility. And it was really fascinating because I was just so struck by that's true. You're 100% correct. If what Catholics believe is not true, then what we do every day, what we do every Sunday, what we do whenever we walk into a Catholic church and genuflect before Jesus' presence in the tabernacle is as bad, if not worse, than the incident of the golden calf in the book of Exodus.
All right, so Father Mike explains that the reason why they worship the Eucharist is because they believe that it is truly God. And this is the doctrine of transubstantiation. I'm not Catholic, but I'm going to try to do it justice. Basically, that the doctrine of transubstantiation is that the bread and the wine, when it's blessed by the priest, literally becomes substantively the body and blood of Christ. So the bread becomes the body of Christ. The blood or the wine becomes the blood of Christ. The accidents, what it appears to be and what it tastes like, for example, that retains the breadness and the wineness. But what it truly is the body and the blood of Christ. And that's a specifically Catholic way of looking at the Eucharist, right? And so if it's the case that that's true, if Catholics are right, then what they do is they're truly worshiping God when they worship the bread and wine. But he rightly points out in a really understanding way that Protestants, especially Protestants who have a more memorialist view, meaning that it's just a symbol of the body and blood, not that the Lord is present in a spiritual way or in a Lutheran way. If Protestants look at that, they might say, that's idolatry. What you're doing is you're worshiping bread and wine, which is not God. Right. And so the distinction is really important. And he points that out. Love what he said there. It's a really good podcast. I definitely suggest listening to it if you're Catholic. And if you're not, you might still find it interesting if you're a nerd like I am. So next, we're going to listen to the second Catholic podcast, which is called Shameless Popery. I'm not sure if it's actually a podcast. I know it's a YouTube channel. I think that's where I've seen him most in the past, but this is by Joe Heschmeyer. And this is the episode called Do Protestants Really Worship God? So on the back of what we've established, that the distinction of what the Eucharist is really important in the Catholic Protestant debate, we're going to listen to this one. I actually agree with the first 26 minutes of what Joe has to say in his video. He starts out with explaining that there's a distinction in what the church does on a Sunday between teaching, prayer, and worship. And he basically says for a long portion of time that teaching and prayer are done really well by Protestants. So that's on the table. He says kind things about Protestants. And then he goes into the category of worship, which he further breaks down into 3 types. Type 1 is presenting your bodies as a living sacrifice. And he gets all of these from Romans 12 and Romans 13, at least the first 2 types. Romans 12 and Hebrews 13. So presenting your bodies as a living sacrifice is type 1. This is offering up your sufferings to the Lord, doing acts of service to others, serving the Lord by loving your neighbors. That's type 1. That's a type of worship that you can do. Type 2, he explains, is a sacrifice of praise. And this is acknowledging God with our words and with our hearts, ideally. And for this one, actually for both of these, he specifically points out that the Protestant pastor, John Piper, makes the same 2 distinctions, the same 2 possibilities for worship. And he, of course, we're drawing these from Scripture, Romans 12, Hebrews 13, which says that worship is the fruit of lips that acknowledge God's name. So it makes sense that everyone would get these 2 types. But the 3rd type is where we differ. And it is for the reason of this 3rd type that he ends up saying, essentially, that Protestants aren't worshiping on their Sunday service, that we're not actually giving God what he's due. We're not worshiping God rightly. And that's a really serious accusation. So let's take a listen and see what he has to say.
So that's what I mean when I say that a lot of Protestant worship isn't worship. I mean this. A lot of it is preaching and teaching, which is great. It's good. Some of it is prayer, which is great and good. But what's missing is the notion of worship, which is sacrificial, which is an offering to God, and that so much of that has been omitted. So you can go to a worship service, in quotation marks, that's just people praying and talking about Jesus. Again, good things, but at no point there are they actually worshiping him.
So what he says there is, at no point are Protestants actually worshiping God. And that's really harsh, even though he's admitted and said really generously that we do teaching and prayer well. And you didn't hear it in that section, but prior to this, if you want to listen to the whole thing, you definitely should. It's a great episode. It shows a lot of similarities between Protestants and Catholics until the end. But he explains that the Protestants do the first and second types of worship well. But because of the importance of this idea of the Eucharist, the way Catholics believe in it specifically, it's to the point where he's willing to say Protestants are missing out on worship during their Sunday morning worship services. And that's really important. So, should we be worried as Protestants that we're not rightly worshiping God? If you were to just watch this video by Joe in a vacuum and have no other thoughts on the matter, if this is your first introduction to this whole idea of the Eucharist and everything, and you don't have your own theology of the Lord's Supper or communion or whatever you want to call it, this could be a problem for you. You could start worrying, and rightly start worrying. Am I worshiping God? And am I giving him what he's due? This is why I'm making this video. Like I said before, not to argue over the doctrine, which one of us is right, but to give some thoughts to Protestants of how we can view this whole debate that Shameless Popery has brought up. So, having watched these two videos, the summary of Catholic thought on the matter from these two, I think this is fair. I really don't want to be strawman. I think this is a fair representation of what Catholics could rightly say and what I think Joe would say, Joe Heschmeyer, if we talk to him. If we synthesize these two videos, we get the following progression. Protestants don't really worship God. Pretty easily stated. Second, this is because they don't believe in the Eucharist the way Catholics do. And that's been highlighted in both videos, right? So Protestants don't worship God because we don't believe in Eucharist in the specific way Catholics do. And the third point, this is something that Protestants might call idolatry. Right? So you have Protestants aren't worshiping God because we don't believe in the transubstantiation doctrine, which is something that we would say is idolatry. This kind of like three-step progression, right? So that's a summary of what we've kind of seen so far. Let's look at the early church now. And I understand that this won't be compelling probably for Catholics, but the hope is that it's compelling for Protestants, and that for Catholics, it might give you some insight into how we as Protestants are thinking about the matter. All right, so listening to all these videos brought to mind something that I learned about the early church, specifically in my time at Baylor when I was taking some church history classes, right? So I was surprised to find out that the Roman Empire, aside from just persecuting the Christians, referred to them often as atheists, saying that they didn't believe in God. And obviously Christians worship a God, so why would this accusation be flung at them? Well, the Romans didn't think that the Christians were worshiping, because they didn't worship the way pagans did. They didn't meet the Roman expectation of how worship should be performed, so they called the Christians atheists. You can see these accusations appearing in the works of Justin Martyr, even a little bit in the Octavius by I always get that wrong, Municius Felix? The Octavius. It's excellent work. Really, really enjoy it. But without going into all of those source documents, I'm going to go to a summary, which is by Everett Ferguson's book, Church History, Volume 1. I think he summarizes the whole idea really well, so I'm going to read that out. Atheism in the ancient world was practical, not theoretical. An atheist was someone who did not observe the traditional religious practices, regardless of what faith he professed. The Christian apologists insisted that Christians believed in God, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit. But this did not satisfy the basis of the objection, for Christians still did not perform the customary ceremonies. So you see what's going on there? Because Christians aren't performing the customary ceremonies the way pagans expect it, they're called atheists. You see how that kind of maps on to what we're talking about here, right? So because Protestants don't worship God the way Catholics expect in the Eucharist, it's said that they're not worshiping. Because the early Christians didn't worship God the way the pagans expected, they were called atheists. And in both of these cases, Protestants see what Catholics are doing as idolatry, oftentimes. The early church saw what pagans were doing as idolatry. So because of us thinking that something is idolatry and seeing it differently, we're being accused of not worshiping. Right. And so if you're a Protestant, you can get from this that these accusations have been thrown out before. I would say that the human heart, as Calvin said, I believe, the human heart is an idol-making machine. We bend towards idolatry. Always we're bending towards the idolatry of loving ourselves or money or sex. That's obvious, right? But the idolatry of worshiping things over God or other gods over God, that bent is in the human heart, and it's really, really easy to carry us away without us realizing it's happening. Because as Protestants, we might look at that and say, like, hey, that really looks like idolatry. If we get thrown at us that you're not worshiping, we can take solace in knowing that that's happened before. The early church said, hey, what you're doing is idolatry, and they were called atheists. So it's not a reason for us to feel shaken. This argument has been thrown at Christians before in the past. It's basically the same thing now. No reason to worry. There's no reason to be concerned that you aren't worshiping, because your church celebrates the table of the Lord in a different way.